Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Homebody Podcast. Today, we are getting into the astrology for the upcoming month of November 2022. And I am joined today by Diana Rose Harper to help us walk through the month ahead and everything that's coming up. In November, we start off with a pretty dramatic month that definitely begins with a lot more intensity than it wraps up. We have really something to move through at the beginning of November. We have this lunar eclipse in Taurus. We have the Sun, Venus, and Mercury moving through their squares to Saturn and their oppositions to Uranus. And then by the end of the month, we have a much more jovial atmosphere that's more friendly to change with a very beautiful new moon in Sagittarius. Diana Rose Harper is joining me today to talk about the forecast. Diana is an astrologer, tarot reader, energy worker, writer, and educator with also a history of being a body worker and a rare books research assistant. Diana Rose has written quite a bit for HausWitch's community page, served as one half of the Rosebud Tarot, and contributed an article on the ethics of astrological prediction to Wired. She's also been featured in many podcasts from the Astrology Podcast, as well as Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. 3 times she's been a lecturer at NORWAC, and we are so excited to have her on the podcast. We really enjoyed putting this episode together for you today, so be sure to go down into the show notes, scroll, check out Diana's links, and leave us a comment if you're watching on YouTube, and share the episode with a friend. Each month, I also make something called a cosmic calendar, which serves as a companion for each month's forecast. The cosmic calendar is an astro calendar that lives inside of Notion, and it includes all the transits that we talk about on the podcast and also some that we didn't have time to get to. And each of those includes a summary, some journal prompts to dive in further, as well as space for your own notes so that you can keep track of how these transits show up for you so that you can get to know your own chart better, understand more of how the stars resonate with your personal meaning-making systems. Because it's in Notion, it can also plug into your workspaces. It creates a very functional archive that you can also search and organize for all of your favorite astro data. So you can actually use what you hear on the forecast each month and have a way to really aggregate and pull together all of the different flecks of astrological joy and information that you pull together each month. You can learn more about the cosmic calendar at the link below, and you can subscribe if you would like to get yours. There's also a free resource below called a Houses cheat sheet. So if you hear us say things like the Aquarius part of your chart or the Sagittarius part of your chart, and you're not really sure what that means or what we're talking about, you can find out. Just go down and sign up and get the Houses cheat sheet. It'll give you a really quick video explaining how to assess what the zodiac signs and how they fit in with what your houses are, what those topics are for you, so you can get a little bit more out of the forecast episode. And lastly, we also have a free Astro meetup that happens on the first Wednesday of each month. So if you would like to join us for the next one coming up in the first week of November, then please sign up to join us. We would love to have you. And with that, let's get into this forecast for November 2022 with Diana Rose Harper. Cool. All right, so we're here kicking off the astrology forecast for November of 2022, and I'm joined today by Diana Rose Harper. Diana, would you mind kicking us off by introducing yourselves to the listeners and letting us know how you'd like us to know you today or meet you for the forecast?
Yeah. So I am someone who is deeply interested in figuring out not just how to be human, but how to be in love with being human, while also being in love with being here on this planet. And the primary, language at this point that I use towards that end is astrology. I'm also a tarot reader. I write stuff. I've done energy work and body work in the past, which informs my practice. And I currently live in Southern California on the traditional lands of the Gabiarino people, the Quiche. And yeah, I don't know. That's kind of the
That's the gist.
Over here trying to be in love with this life thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
I relate very much to that in all of the ways. And we were talking before we hit record that you were saying that November sort of like comes in like a lion and out like a lamb, which feels very true as we dive in. Do you have any other kind of like big picture things that you want to kind of frame or post before we jump into some of the more minute transits?
I mean, when I look at the transits of November, I mean, they feel very I mean, just like entering into November with an eclipse season, with Mars having just stationed retrograde, there's like also just like the first week we have these tense aspects between Venus hanging out in Scorpio with other things in the chart that aren't the sweetest, cutest things. But then by the end of the month, like there's a little bit of buoyancy that kind of comes in, especially like starting around the center of the month. So I feel like it's one of those Novembers where the like end of November feasts, like whatever people choose to celebrate, are going to feel really feasty. You know, like one of the things, maybe we'll touch on this later, like one of the things I've been really looking at is Thanksgiving weekend, as really facilitating the tryptophan splat in a positive way. So I'm really I'm looking forward to my birthday, which is at the end of November, and hoping that the process between now and then is constructive, even if it's a little uncomfortable. So
yeah. Definitely. It feels the end of the month is definitely more boisterous and jovial. And the beginning of the month, it's like we have to get squeezed through some really tight thing. And then at the end, it's going to be like, so hopefully, it'll be interesting. And we'll definitely appreciate the end of the month a lot more, I think, because of that portal / process. So
agreed. Strong agree.
Yeah. So
definite generation of gratitude and thankfulness.
For sure.
Kind of
We're not there anymore.
Yeah.
Give thanks.
Yeah.
So yeah, that feels really true. So the first week in November, we'll just jump right in. We have, Venus is in Scorpio at the moment, and Venus is going to oppose Uranus and then square Saturn. And so we've had this thing for the past couple of years because Saturn and Uranus have been in this square with one another. Every time the planets are moving through the fixed signs, they sort of have to squeeze through or get forced through this really uncomfortable tunnel of Uranus and Saturn. And so this is Venus's turn to do that in Scorpio, which is happening the first week in November. And then of course the Mercury and the Sun will follow suit. But speaking of Venus in particular, what are you sort of thinking about this squeeze, particularly as it's moving through Scorpio this time around?
I mean, it's super interesting because, as we're recording this, we're in the lead up to the Venus cazimi. So by the time people are listening to this, we'll be in the aftermath of the first Venus cazimi in Libra since the 1870s, which is just incredible. But Venus is basically going to remain inside of that, like depending on how people calculate, there's like different ideas around what counts as cazimi, but essentially Venus enters Scorpio in a cazimi with the Sun. And so the first week of November, we see Venus like surpassing the Sun, like getting past the Sun. Is no longer, it's like still conjunct, but it's no longer empowered in the cazimi. And so it like leaves this like deep exfoliation of like the Sun's inner chambers and this like resuscitation experience. And then is immediately like, oh fuck, there's Uranus. Oh, can I cuss? Sorry.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay,
no.
cool.
Sorry,
sometimes I have
that's a thing. Absolutely, you can.
Sometimes I have the mouth of a sailor, so I'll try not to get that far. But
it's fine.
Venus is like immediately accosted essentially by Uranus, and then like kind of pinched by Saturn. And so there's something a little bit like I don't know, like a Bildungsroman or like a coming of age story of no longer tucked inside like the wing, like the safe wing of the mentor figure, which we could see as the Sun, and this sort of dropped into this location like Scorpio, where Venus has none of her preferred tools for Venusing, instead has these very penetrative, deep, dark Mars tools, right? It's Venus in Mars's goth sign, essentially, like the most goth place. And, immediately electrified by Uranus, like having to be like, okay, I can't actually just wuss out here in Scorpio. And then just a few days later, Saturn's like, and what are you going to actually make out of your time there? Right. So it's not the sweet, cuddly party with like honeyed cakes that Venus might default to, given, it's like if nothing else was going on. But there is sort of this test of like, what matters to you and what are you going to build out of what matters to you? Understanding that sometimes the clarity of what matters to you is like comes from loss, or like comes from really like touching those deep places that we hesitate to touch because, it smells bad, it feels bad, it's like whatever, but it like has to come up and out at some point.
Yeah. It sort of feels like, especially that Kazemi moment too in Libra, it feels so ecstatic. This really special, like unionizing of something with Venus in this very queenly, powerful place. And then, just getting dumped into the place where she's like in Kill Bill training, which is not her favorite, and just getting cut a lot at every attempt. And I feel that, I used the word accosted earlier to talk about, the Uranus opposition squaring Saturn. It's sort of just being like, I don't know. It just feels sort of like an unexpected like twist in the plot, or that like insurgent spirit that adds discomfort. It's one thing if you're just sort of like surrendering to the experience. And it's another thing if you're just like refusing it and rebutting it at all costs. And then Saturn really like adding the weightiness to a journey that's already intense. If you're like, elbow crawling your way through a spiky, intense journey, and then Saturn's like, here's 8 more backpacks. It's like there's a way that there's like a disagreement of like how the weight is distributed, what responsibilities happening. This, I think things are going to just feel very constrictive and unpleasant. Like comfort is going to be hard to find, I think.
Right. One interesting thing about this too, though, is like Venus is the one that's moving. And so Venus is the one that's looking at Uranus and looking at Saturn as she's moving through Scorpio. So even if it's uncomfortable for Venus, there's also sort of this sense of giving to Uranus and giving to Saturn some amount of her experience from the place of Scorpio, right? And so it's like looking at Uranus and being like, what do you actually love? Like, why are you running around with Molotov cocktails, right? And like, what's the like depth analysis, comprehension of that? And then, she's looking at Saturn in Aquarius from Scorpio being like, you're trying to create or solidify these like worldview structures, but are you seeing the underbelly of these worlds as you are creating these worldviews? Right. So there's also something there of the, like for some reason right now I'm thinking about like the Banshee, right? Like the wailing women of the Moors. I was just thinking of that. Yeah. And just being like, you have not sufficiently mourned these things. You are trying to move forward without actually having like depth of feeling with that like heart's blood that's been poured out. Like, are you going to acknowledge that there's heart blood being poured out or not? So
it's like provocative. It's that way.
Provocative, but from this place of like deeply earnest love
and
right?
Connection.
Like, yeah, the love that is revealed through grief, so
yeah, and has scars attached to it, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then, moving into November 8th, we have, as we talk about kind of like intense things and wailing women, we move into the total lunar eclipse in Taurus, which is happening on November 8th. And this has, I feel like this eclipse is like reining in a lot of different feeds at once. It's opposing Mercury, it's square Saturn, it's conjunct Uranus, and on the North Node. Like it's very like there's a lot kind of getting vortexed, I feel like, in this lunar eclipse. It feels very I feel like I've said it, we'll say dramatic at the very least. We can unpack that. But you first, how are you feeling about this lunar eclipse?
Well, I've been calling it the Uranus eclipse, just like I've been calling the Venus conjoined eclipse the Ven eclipse.
Great. Perfect.
Right. We have a Ven eclipse and we have a Uranus eclipse, which honestly brings forward that Venus-Uranus opposition on November 5th. Like thematically speaking, it's in between, like leaning more towards the Uranus eclipse, but it's in between these two eclipses that implicates Venus and Uranus, right? And so, I mean, I've been looking at this eclipse for like years, being like, what is going to happen? What is that? What is that? Because, it's like the moon is going to be at 16 Taurus. Uranus is at 16 degrees, 56 minutes Taurus. So they're very conjunct. Venus is very still much conjunct the sun. Mercury is getting really close to its exact cazimi with the sun. There's something here, like one of the things I think about with Uranus actually comes in part from the work of Mark Jones, who talks about Uranus as sort of like as the evolutionary astrologers like to say, like a higher octave of one of the traditional planets. And with Uranus, it's like a higher octave of Mercury. And so there's this communication capacity, this transmitting capacity. And Mark's work specifically talks about Uranus alongside intergenerational trauma, like epigenetic consequences of traumatic events and experiences. Wherever there is intergenerational trauma transmission, there is also intergenerational joy transmission. It's just requires a little bit more effort to go find the joy, right? And so as I've been looking at this eclipse, Mercury in Scorpio is very psychopompic, right? Venus in Scorpio is very like delighting in the scent of the compost, right? Delighting in the underbelly stuff. And so there's something here about the potential of sort of like volcanic eruptions, whether those be the Uzi eruptions of Hawaiian volcanoes or the like explosive eruptions of like, Mount St. Helens or Mount Vesuvius or something, actually coming up and out this magma that's been lingering. Some people, it might be like a spontaneous compost combustion, right? But there's really something like activating and revelatory, but because it's Uranus, because it's an eclipse, it's chaotic neutral. And so, there's a benefic involved, but it's a benefic in Scorpio that's like kind of like, oh, what's happening? The moon is exalted, but it's like exalted
Eclipsed.
alongside, it's eclipsed and it's alongside like spiky Uranus. So we add on the fact that it's within a square to Saturn. So Saturn is being like, what are the structures? What is the meaning? What are the traditions? Right? It's, I don't know. It's a lot. Very much a bold italic underscore multiple like question mark exclamation points question mark exclamation point kind of situation.
Asterisk footnote.
Yeah,
I like the image of the volcano because Taurus all being this kind of like weighty earthy sign. We have the square to Saturn also being something we would consider having weight, and then Venus and Scorpio being also like underneath something. The extent to which she's enjoying or not will depend. But I think meeting that Uranic energy, it's like the more weight we add to something and then we like vibrate it or cause a mass shift, the more dramatic it is, the more collateral it is. It's like thinking of like a huge, brick building that we put TNT in versus like something that's more like airy and feathery. So it has a really big collateral or like a wide ring of effect and it's like you can't predict where every stone is going to fall or what's going to happen. We just know it has weight to it and it's noticeable. And I was thinking a lot too about just the ways that a lot of people right now are trying to like renegotiate their relationship to land, their understanding to how we belong to land or we quote own land and things like that. Talking about, you were mentioning like epigenetics and inheritances and ancestry and things like that, how that's been coming up a lot for people. And I was thinking of that when you're talking about with Uranus moving through Taurus in particular. I think Saturn too, bringing that sort of like restrictive element. And then of course we have more of this, the liberation element of Uranus and those just being in a push and pull and there being something that desires to be triumphant, I think, but it's just that liberation in some ways or breakthroughs in some ways are just not clean things.
I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot just throughout this time of Saturn square Uranus is the fact that to change a worldview, it's the same as like changing a nervous system. It's not that it's impossible, it's that it is disruptive, and oftentimes it requires disruption in order for that change to actually occur. So, it's not that Saturn is constricting or restricting necessarily, but more representative of something that requires more effort to alter.
And it's
right?
like an edge, It's like, I think a part of the healing, especially the nervous system, it's like if you don't know where your edge is, it's really hard to like find a sense of like what a true embodied boundary is, or when without a true embodied boundary, it's really hard to know like where I begin and where you end in a body, and say yes and say no and feel our like embodied yes.
Yeah. I mean, and that's like a perfect segue into, so it's like we have the eclipse on the 8th, on the 9th, like, not even 24 hours later, the sun makes its exact opposition to Uranus. But then on the 10th, we get the first of a collection of things trining Neptune as these things move through Scorpio. And so this like boundaries thing, I think, really comes up here, where it's just like to be, if anything, like this eclipse could be very revelatory in terms of where boundaries are necessary, whether those are boundaries of like what's coming at you or boundaries of what you are pushing out, or a combination thereof. And then that Venus Neptune trine is like, this is why you want boundaries, right? Because as pleasurable as, full union might be, you also need to, like, we can't exist in the world without our own distinct like ego structures, right? Like we can't remain in ego death without just like dying.
Yeah, it's like a psychotic break, really.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think there's sort of a setup here of like what happens when you see something you cannot unsee, and what does that make possible to imagine now that you have seen what was previously unseen, but that you can't, it's on your retinas now, you can't take it back.
Yeah. And what does that look like to integrate or like embody it? Like that Venus trine, it could be very like diffuse, I think, and poignant, especially in like the water sign trines, I think. And it makes me think of like, we have these experiences of whether they're like ecstatic or mystical or psychedelic or whatever they are, and they can be extreme and beautiful and revelatory in all of these ways. But then there's the work of like, and what does that mean living in my body? What does that mean coming to my own experience, to my own yard, to my own house, to my own work, to my job? And a lot of times I like in myself, and when I see with others or speak with others, it's like there's usually a tendency to like throw out everything that was before because of this new experience. Because it's like, well, what was before doesn't make sense, but it's like a harder job, I think, to like pull them into your current life and let it sort of like rumble beneath the surface into the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's actually quite beautifully set up where, after the Scorpio planets trine Neptune, they trine Jupiter. And, Jupiter, I was just thinking about this morning, because I'm like preemptively anticipating Jupiter in Taurus, but just how stabilizing Jupiter is. Jupiter creates the opportunity to perceive and participate in the creation of meaning for all sorts of experiences. And so, especially when we're thinking about the like integration, like post-eclipse integration, post, all of these things opposing Uranus integration, post Neptune trine integration, Jupiter's right there being like, yeah, we're going to just like have a sit down. We're going to do some journaling. We're going to like feel how our bodies feel different now, and like actually maybe make some sort of like philosophical conclusions from our experiences that we can actually like take with us, like some, it's like some cheese in your backpack when you're going on the hike after the like initiatory experience. So I feel like that's important to keep in mind. And this is part of why it's like, don't get too bogged by the experience of the first bit of November, because there is this support through the last half of November.
Yeah. And like the ability, because like we're also moving from like this very like fixed energy. The eclipse is happening in a fixed, everyone else is in Scorpio or Aquarius. So all these things that, again, we don't want to move usually, or the areas of our life that we don't like to change or disrupt, which makes them disrupted even more difficult to process a lot of the times we're attached to how they are. And so, yeah, you're just speaking again too, to like that flow of November. It's like, and then we're moving more into like more mutable energy by the end of the month as well, where things are changing with greater ease. And then, like you're saying, we have those trines to Jupiter, where it's like Jupiter's offering us like a pillow and a perspective to sort of greet what's our meditation cushion or both, to sort of like help it all land in a really like in a way that helps us again diffuse with greater ease, I think, and transition there.
Off gas, I feel like for some reason is also coming up, like off gassing, like I don't know,
especially for Jupiter, it feels like a great thing. That's a great
word. It's just being like, okay, some really smelly things happened in here. We're just gonna open up the windows. We're gonna like spritz a little like freshener in the air and like really allow things to. I feel like water-based air freshener somehow feels like apt for this month.
Just clean out the pores. So yeah, you talk about, we move from that intense eclipse into, the sun's going to go through the Uranus Saturn square. So opposing Uranus on the 9th and then squaring Saturn on the 11th. And then Mercury is of course following suit with that trine to Neptune on the 10th. Mercury will also square Saturn. And so again, it just feels again of the different ways that we're pinging some of these similar concepts. Like, how are we going to talk about it? How are we going to look at it? What is the perspective here? Who's leading through here? It's sort of different ways that we're all kind of like, it's all getting picked at, I think, and interpreted. And I think perhaps some post eclipse, some of that is also like sorting through what does it look like on the other side of this volcanic eruption, perhaps.
Yeah. As the dust settles. Oh, that's actually another kind of like beautiful image. It's just like if there's like an explosion of some kind with the eclipse, the aspects to Neptune and Jupiter in the aftermath is sort of like the rain that clears the particulates out of the sky, like helps the ash to actually settle. And then, ash is such a, like, whenever there's not too much, but it can be such a nutritive like amendment to soil, right? But you have to have water in order for, those minerals to actually get into the soil so that the plants can take up like that benefit. So interesting. I like that image.
The transfer to happen. Yeah, I like that image too. I had this image with the sun squaring Saturn of like, especially the sun in Scorpio, like having these, because the sun isn't like depressed there, there's a way that it's like, oh, I'm shining light and I also have skills. And thinking of like Saturn and Aquarius, they're being sort of like that old king. I was just thinking of like those moments in the mythic movies where it's like the warrior is coming in from the field and is like, this is what's actually happening. And the king who stays in the castle all the time, surrounded by like books and riches, is like, no, we're actually going to do this. Like that disconnect from reality in a sense, but they're like, no, we just came in from the field and this is what's actually happening. I was thinking a little bit of like the kind of conflict or disagreement in perspective from that too. It's like, no, we just came from the hills of the volcano and this is actually what we need to do.
Yeah.
And then we start moving into some different tones by mid-November. We have, the first of the trines to Jupiter, which you were talking about on November 15th, where Venus is going to trine Jupiter, which I feel really excited about. Is there anything that you want to say about Venus, that Venus trine Jupiter in particular, from Scorpio to Jupiter and Pisces?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, Jupiter is in the sign of Venus's exaltation. And there's something I think quite beneficial about, Jupiter sort of conferring this reminder that, literally you're almost done, babe. Like you're almost done with being in Scorpio. And the fact that it's happening like right at the very tail end of Scorpio also, there's like, you know, it's kind of like the images that for some reason that's coming to mind is like ultra marathoners, and like when they're really close to the end, and like, you know, their friend like finds them in the last, like, you know, 5 miles, and like runs alongside them, and like has snacks and like electrolyte gummies or whatever. It's like that's kind of the situation where it's like Jupiter's not like, you get to quit, you don't have to finish the marathon, but you know, here's some nutrients to get you through this like last little drag before you literally come to my house, right? Because this trine with Jupiter is right before Venus enters Sagittarius, you know, Jupiter's other domicile. So maybe it's also like running alongside, get like electrolytes, and like, here's some keys. I'm going to go back to that. Like, I'm going to make sure, like, I'm going to call the like the groundskeeper to make sure that there's like a bushel of apples on the stoop when you arrive, you know, like that kind
the
of
Airbnb
thing.
will be prepped.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, you know, do you want to roast chicken or do you want to roast duck, you know? Kind of this check-in moment. And I think that's like really, you know, it's like the fact that it's like literally it's the Ides of November, right? It's the middle of the month, and so like this is the beginning of the tone shift for the month, I think.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I had this image for this Venus trine Jupiter. I watched this very short, like 45-minute documentary on, it's an outlet called Water Bear, where they do a lot of like videos around like ecological conservation, restoration, and activism and things like that. And this one was called Fish People. So it's all about these people which of course I love, and people whose lives have been transformed by the sea. And the first woman is, she's a spearfisher, and it shows it like on one breath, she goes like down like 100 feet into the ocean with her little, like her flippers and her thing and her spear, like shooting these fish. And of course you interact with sharks down there. And she's talking about learning to interact with sharks. And the first time it really scared her, but then the second time it was more like, she was like, this is my fish. Like she really kind of like stood up in her energy, and the shark backed away. And then there's literally video footage of her just like holding onto the dorsal fin of a great white shark, just cruising like they're buddies. You know, I was like, Venus trine Jupiter and Venus is in Scorpio. Like I can swim with a shark, and it now
so
is
badass.
Fine. It's now fine. Yeah. I'd
so
watch
badass.
it just for that. I was like, that is fucking dope. So that's what I think about when I think of this Venus trine Jupiter. You're like, I was scared of you, but now we swim together. You are a great white shark, and I do have to hold my breath.
Yeah.
But like, we're down deep and we're swimming together.
Yeah. Wow. That's so badass. I love that so much.
Really
I think dope. Like that really is such a perfect image of like what the gift of Venus and Scorpio can bring, right? Where it's like, okay, Venus and Scorpio is not Venus and Taurus. And that also means that Venus and Scorpio gets skills and experience and wisdom that Venus and Taurus doesn't.
Yeah. That we don't get from being comfortable all the time.
Yeah.
Because Venus and Taurus likes to be comfortable. Nothing wrong with that, but it can be a limiting experience. And then the next day, like you said, Venus enters Sagittarius at the same time that Mercury is having that trine to Jupiter. And then that Venus
cute.
is crossed.
I love it so much.
So cute. She's now at the Airbnb. There is roasted duck on the table. There's definitely more, you know, boisterous, jovial things happening here. Do you want to speak to that?
I mean, I'm just imagining like Venus and Sag is like, okay, there's roast duck, but like literally this is sort of like a farm. It's like an estate.
Wild horses.
It's outside. Like, yeah, there's a combination of wild horses, but then also like horses that you can ride.
Yeah.
And like, you know, that like the archery field is all set up, and, you know, like depending on, you know, it's a little bit late.
She becomes like Maid Marian from Robin Hood.
Exactly. It's like a little late in the season for apple picking, but there's definitely some good, like, I don't know, maybe there's some good mushrooming that's available, you know, just like traipsing through the woods with like a little basket and like a hat, and, you know, just like going out and like enjoying being in the experience of autumn, you know, which, you know, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it's enjoying the experience of spring, I guess. But still there's something here of, you know, like one of the things that I think about with like Sagittarius and Libra, it's like Libra is where it's like that Libra is the season when, if you're a leaf viewer person, like that's when you want to be in New England and just like goo goo gaga eyes over like how beautiful the tree fashion show is. Whereas like Sagittarius is like all of the leaves are pretty much gone, but that means that you get to jump in the leaf piles. You know, there's like, you know, Sagittarius has such like golden retriever energy, and so Venus in Sagittarius is like playing with the dogs and the leaves. You know?
That feels on. I just had some like Outlander vibes show up for that, which I don't hate. Yeah, definitely more room to roam, and like this desire to like explore without, it's not like there's not going to be a great white shark around the corner. So like, let's go a little farther and like see what fun
we might actually see a moose. Oh my God.
Yeah.
So great.
Elk.
Yeah,
for sure. If we get on the horse, we can go even faster, which is fun.
Yeah.
And then on November 17th, the following day, I love this month, feels so successional so much. The Mercury is entering Sagittarius on the 17th. And for Mercury, it's a little bit different of a transition, because I feel like, you know, I feel like there's a special way that Mercury can feel swamped in Scorpio, but it's kind of, it doesn't hate it. It's more like just buried under like books and research, and like, I said in last month's episode, it feels like sort of the CIA board with like this red dot connects to this red dot, like building these intense maps, or at least that's what it feels like to me. And then in Sagittarius, it makes me feel like, you know, the person who works at the nonprofit, who like works for the, you know, like there's the visionary person who's like, the world could be this way. And then there's the administrator who's actually like making all of that stuff happen. And they're like, no, you don't understand the like 55 million steps that have to happen between this and this. And that to me feels like Mercury and Sagittarius, where it's swamped in a different way.
Yeah. You know, I'm a Mercury and Sagittarius native. So, you know, like when I think about Mercury and Sagittarius, it's like, that's why I do metaphors, right? Like this experience of like words, like detailed words, like the precise, you know, fact words, like they're not big enough to actually say what I'm trying to say. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I need to talk about like golden retrievers, not just Sagittarius, you know, it's like this, like the
I'm
image.
a Mercury and Scorpio native, so I'm the one with the CIA board.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, like Mercury in Sagittarius is technically a Mercury in detriment, right? But one of the things I love to think about is how like the mutable signs are all ruled by Jupiter and Mercury. They all square and oppose each other. And they're just, it's about scale. Right. And like, this is actually something I got from the work of Kira Taborn, like specifically this image of just like, you know, Jupiter and a Mercury sign is like someone with really big hands trying to make like those little miniature kitchenette things. And Mercury and a Jupiter sign is like a tiny little like a Tinkerbell, like in the giant's castle trying to figure out how to do something. Right. So there's this like figuring out how to use the tools that are available when like the inherent skill set is a different size than the tools that are around, right? So Mercury enters Sag and it's like, wow, it's really cool and everything's too big. You know? Yeah, it's like, yeah, I always think about like hummingbirds when I think about Mercury, and it's like hummingbirds like surrounded by a bunch of, you know, the most gigantic flowers.
Yeah, it makes the word mythic proportions comes to mind. Yeah, where it literally is like, it feels like of such a mythic size. Like there's no Goldilocks thing happening here. That's not existing. It also makes me think too of this like propensity for, if we're zooming out a little bit, it's like this propensity for like, you know, every time you tell a story, the fish gets like 20 pounds bigger. Like, it's like, how do we even like speak about the big thing? So like when we tell the story, it keeps getting like added proportions, like more mythology, more symbols, more colors. Oh, and then this is what didn't actually happen, but maybe it did because it would sound better this way. And like sometimes what is accurate isn't the most important thing for a story.
Right. Or sometimes it's like the creation, like what you think is necessary for the creation of accuracy isn't, because I think that's one of the things that Mercury and Sagittarius as someone who has it is like editing, right? Like there was a long time when I only journaled in like the most concise verse possible, because I was like, I can't use so many words anymore. I have to like shrink it down. So it's like Mercury and Sagittarius can have this thing of like, I'm trying to like get to a conclusion, but I'm like getting diverted on all of these side quests because all of the details feel necessary in order for you to understand what I'm really trying to tell you.
For sure.
When it's actually like, I'm pretty sure there's like an as the crow flies way to get to that conclusion that you could take that would be sufficient. You don't need all the details.
But then you don't get the story.
Right. I mean, I think about adaptation, right? So like adaptations of like books to movies, for example. And, you know, I have a tradition of watching the extended editions of Lord of the Rings every year.
100.
Right. And it's also like the extended edition, even the extended editions don't have everything that's in the novels, right? So when you read the Lord of the Rings and you watch the Lord of the Rings, you can see all of the things that had to get taken out in order for the core thread of the story to translate to the screen. Mercury and Sagittarius is like, no, we have to have a like, you know, 10 season series in order for all of the details of the Lord of the Rings to be included.
Yeah. Like, hello.
Like, come on.
I know. Yeah. Yeah, the extended edition. That feels like the perfect. That feels like the perfect hashtag for this. Yeah, one of my things for Sagittarius is quests and questions. So I love that you were talking about side quests because the video game.
I'm always going on a side quest.
Live for a side quest.
Exactly.
The next thing, and then we have the sun moving into its trine to Jupiter on Sunday, November 20th. So this is sort of the last of the three to get that pillow and that perspective. And I feel like, especially with the sun and Jupiter having that meaning, that there is sort of an illumination possible that can potentially like wrap up some of the earlier parts of the month and like not necessarily put a bloody bow on it, but but just help us have a sense of like you moved through the 3 sessions and now you're in session number 3 and we can like wrap the experience, close this journal, burn whatever that thing needed to be burned, plan, you know, whatever the thing is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's also something here of, so it's like whenever the sun and Jupiter are in a trine aspect with each other, like that's really close to the Jupiter stationing, right? It's like either stationing direct or retrograde. And so there's an extra special potency to specifically like the sun when it's trine Jupiter. This is also true for its trine with Saturn and etc. But like, you know, it feels very stabilizing. So like just very like it's like a reaffirmation of faith, a reaffirmation of belief. And again, just like the ends of these signs, there's like a hey kid, you got it kind of feeling.
It feels too like thinking about it with, you know, thinking of them as like royal planets in a sense too, that there's also a sense of like power with those, like a little more power, a little more agency. Or it's like, you know, the seat of the heart meeting with the guru in a sense, like there's a very like pure interaction because there's a leveling of power in a way that can be exchanged and less teacher student, which can happen a lot with Jupiter. And that feels like a really, I don't know, it feels really perfect to me actually.
Yeah. Agreed.
On Monday, November 21st, the following day, Mercury will conjoin Venus in Sagittarius. And to me, it feels very lighthearted. It feels like, I don't know, like cheerful messaging or attempted at like drops of hope or something, or extended edition, the hope edition, potentially. Like maybe some of the T's and the I's are not crossed, or we do side quests to go find those. But it has a lot of enthusiasm potentially attached to it. How do you feel about the conjunction?
I feel really excited about it because it's happening very close to something I have in Sagittarius.
Because it's mine.
It's mine. I'm going to eat it. Yeah. No, I mean, I love just Venus Mercury conjunctions in general. Like it can be really chatty, but it's like you and whoever you're talking with are very much on the same page. Both of you are really down for whatever direction things are going in. I'm also reminded of like the the stereotypical like lesbian first date where it's like 2 days long and you go on a whole bunch of different adventures, and at the end of it you're like, wait, so when are we getting the U-Haul?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So are we moving in together?
Yeah, so you're my favorite person in the whole world and I've only known you for 48 hours. That there's something very especially like along like this happening in Sagittarius with Jupiter, the ruler, hanging out in Pisces in close proximity with Neptune. It's very oh my God, I love this.
It feels like doe eyes.
This is so nice. Yeah, it's like it's doe eyes, and it's also like, can we just road trip forever? Like, do we have to go back? Like, I think there's
right
also
off into the sunset.
yeah, it's like, what are the possibilities? Like whenever you come into conversation with someone whose way of thinking stimulates your own mind and your own heart in a way that it's just like, oh, this is what the future could be. Right? Like, I think it's really beautiful from that standpoint. And I would definitely recommend, wherever about 7 degrees Sagittarius lands in your chart, whatever house that's in, whatever that might be aspecting, to allow that kind of doe-eyed curiosity, that like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed enthusiasm, to really come through. I think that's generally good, but I feel like especially given like the past few years and like the surrounding like astrological situation, like it is so important to really deliberately engage with those transit moments and those activities in life that refill the life can be good bucket.
Yeah, this is giving me a lot of Friendsgiving vibes.
Oh yeah.
Because I think there's something that or at least I experience with Jupiterian signs, is there's this capacity for everything to sort of become everything. And this being just sort of a way to like be in love with a lot of the way I feel like very much in love with all of my friends is like, no, you can just be in love with all of them at the same time and everyone. And then we're all at the table and then we're all eating. It just feels like very Friendsgiving and very like in love with everyone. And that I feel great about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like this aspect is going to be alive for the weekend prior to that Monday. So if you are somebody that's trying to schedule a Friendsgiving, November 19th, November 20th, like
sounds like a good time.
That would be the time.
Do it. Don't hold back. That's what we're saying.
No holding back.
And then on Tuesday, November 22nd, the sun enters Sagittarius, which again, we have these like pursuits of quests and questions. Would you like to speak to the sun in Sagittarius?
Yeah, I mean, sun in Sag is, this is such an excellent time, in my opinion, to do some deliberate meaning making. Right, like to kind of center in like your own kind of like the lamp that you carry with you everywhere. Like I try to have like metaphors for all of the signs, whatever. And like the one that I like to use for Sagittarius is like the chaga conch that you can like carve out and like put a coal in, so that way you can carry your campfire from one place to another. Right? Like you don't carry the whole fire. You can't do that, but you do have like a good container, and like carrying the fire from campsite to campsite, like that's both like a literal thing, but it's also the metaphorical thing of stories. Like I think about Sag season, I think about like, I think very Northern Hemisphere seasons. Apologies to any Southern Hemisphere people listening to this, but like the real fire that you're bringing is the warmth of camaraderie, right? The warmth of connection, the warmth of like sharing your stories, but also having the experience of other people sharing theirs with you, and how like that storytelling experience is part of the expansion of experience more broadly, and the expansion of like, what does it mean to be human really? so that there's like that's the Sagittarian gregariousness, right? Of just being like, yeah, I do want to hear your stories. Oh my God, your life is so fascinating. Thank you for sharing. This is so cool. Can I tell you something that just reminded me of? And like that banter sort of experience. And so then the sun in Sag is just like, how do you bring your heart, like the chaga conch with the coal in it? How do you bring your heart with you to those interactions and understand that like that philosophical core, that meaning making core is like part of the point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the way that the horizon is available, like to me, it always, I don't know if it's actually true, but it always feels like the stars are more visible this time of
Mm.
year when it's cold
Mhm.
outside. And again, I don't know if that's true, but it feels true. And so like, yeah, like you're saying, like being outside with the fire, with the people, the
Mhm.
guitars, the whatever, and then just looking up and then having that like expanse available too, like
Mhm.
just so aware of that context in that moment. The stories and the stars. And just, I feel like that also feels very Jupiterian and serving that meaning making that you're speaking to,
Mhm.
um, of remembering where we are and what it is to be human in like that big way.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
Wednesday, November 23rd, Jupiter stations direct in Pisces, which, you know, it gives us this final little chapbook of some potent Jupiter in its own domicile medicine, which
Mhm.
I like to sort of bring this year to more of a close. How do you feel about Jupiter stationing direct?
I feel excited about it. I know there have been people who are like, oh man, but like Jupiter and Pisces last time was like, oh, maybe not exactly what I thought it would be. But one of the things that I think is really beautiful about Jupiter is like, yeah, Jupiter wants to like provide good stuff, but part of the process of receiving good stuff is having pointed out to you where and when, or like where and how you're not actually ready to receive those things. And so, when as Jupiter is about, like as we're recording this, Jupiter is about to move back into Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
Through November will be in Pisces. Um, like there's like the direct station facilitating sort of this, oh, I actually am clear now on what I want to receive that's good and how I can honor that well, whatever that might be. Yeah, and to feel like there's, I don't know, Jupiter direct stations always kind of feel like a resuscitation of possibility to me. Um, and just that like the coherence of
Mm-hmm.
possibility. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like too. It can feel overwhelming, that level of like coherence that I feel
Mhm.
like Jupiter and Pisces can bring, like that sense of like everything is connected, which is cliche until Jupiter is actually in Pisces. And then you just have a sense of what that could feel
Mhm.
like and what that is. And it can feel like too much.
Mhm.
And so for me, anyways, what you're talking about, like, you know, that second round of Jupiter and Pisces was everyone who kind of being like, oh, I didn't know I would have to actually like stretch more or do whatever that thing
Mhm.
is to hold it. But perhaps now that this is sort of a third, our little chat book
Mhm.
resuscitation, that we might perhaps have a little more capacity carved out and carved through us, even potentially from the Scorpio and from the first Scorpio transits, the first part of the month, finding a little more capacity in ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And on the same day that Jupiter stations direct, we have the new moon in Sagittarius,
Mhm.
which I feel it feels like a sweet seed bed, I think, especially thinking about the little fire that we carry with us,
Mhm.
to sort of bring the month to something that's a little more bonfire-y. How
Yeah.
about the new moon in Sagittarius for you?
I mean, it's the first moon after eclipse season, so that always carries with it a sensation of relief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the interesting things about that particular new moon is that it's in a really tight square with the asteroid Vesta, which is at 0 degrees Pisces at the moment that the new moon happens. And Vesta is the asteroid that's most associated with fire.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's something here about like the keyword that I use for Vesta is devotion, because if you think about like what is fire, especially in a pre-industrial, pre-electrified era, it's life, it's light, it's warmth, it's heat, and it's also like always dangerous. And so it requires lots of feeding, and it also requires lots of care. And so that devotion is a required part of continuing to engage with life and light and heat and like etc. And this is real fire, this is also metaphorical fire. And so this new moon, right in the first little bit of Sagittarius, square Vesta, has this kind of like, you know, I'm like the phrase that's coming to mind is like, nobody is obliged to turn towards the negative things that they have experienced as though they are lessons or as though they are meaningful. And also, it can be so healing to create meaning and to create learning from negative experiences. And that's kind of this Vestal activity of being like, here's some shit that happened, and I'm going to burn it. And I'm not just going to burn it in like a non, like just to get rid of it. It's a burning it as though there is fuel available within it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's like kind of what I'm thinking about with this particular new moon, is just like, what is it that you are burning? With the understanding that the heat that's coming from that is like, it's meaningful, it's useful, it's fuel in some way.
Yeah, I think a lot of times with Vesta, I think of how in English anyways, the word heart is embedded in the word hearth.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
And that's just a very like Vestal thing for me. And I think especially with thinking about Vesta and Pisces, it just makes me think about, there's these sacred spaces all over the world that are made sacred because people keep the fire going. Like,
yes.
I think, where is it? St. Bridget's Cathedral. It's like people have been feeding that fire for hundreds of years. Like, and I'm like, I think that's the only reason the world has not exploded at this point, is because there are people who are in service to the fire in that way. Like, they keep the fire on, and they're like holding the fire of humanity in a really big way. And I think the invitation to find what that is for us, like how are we contributing to that, whether it's a literal fire that we keep going, or it's something that we keep burning in ourselves brightly, like for the world. It feels like Vesta and Pisces is very in service to that vision, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this would be, for people who are into ritualizing new moons. Like, I don't recommend doing anything really for eclipses except being respectful.
Staying out of the middle.
Just respectfully high, right? But with this particular lunation, doing some kind of explicit fire tending, I feel like could be a really beautiful way to ritualize it. Yeah.
Agreed. And I guess the last thing that we can bring up before we wrap up November is that Mars, who is now retrograde, will trine Saturn in Aquarius. And this is the second time. That I think the first time it happened was at the end of September. So we have the malefics like collaborating in air signs and kind of boosting one another's agendas. And they've already heard me talk about it, but do you have anything that you'd like to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, this particular iteration I think is interesting because Mars's ruler Mercury is right across the street. In Sagittarius, and in, technically again in detriment, but so Mars is the one that needs help, and Saturn is kind of providing that, because Saturn is direct, it's in domicile. Like, at that point in time, it's also in an interesting little aspect with the asteroid Hygieia, which I won't go too far into that story, but there's something about if you can keep a hold of your worldview, the worldview that matters, Saturn and Aquarius, the sensation of martial Gemini chaos can be mitigated and soothed in important and significant ways. It's like, why are you in chaos? Like, not in a like, why are you chaotic kind of way, but like, actually, what is it like? Can you take a little bit of a step back and see your process and feel that your process is supported in some way? And then one really interesting thing about like this trifecta of trines between Saturn and Mars is that the next time that they form a trine, they'll both have moved into water signs.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that, I think, like, I'm fascinated by that, because there's this reminder that, like, yeah, we can do all this stuff in the air realms, like up in our head, but the thing that really brings it down is the emotions. Like, emotions are how our brains, like our intellectual capacities, end up landing in our bodies. Right. So I think it's really important to try to actively perceive that which is supportive at this particular moment. So
yeah, the movement from that second trine to the third, it feels like, you know, it's like we've been looking for answers in the library and realizing we have to like leave the library in order to really get the solution or the resolution that we're looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I feel like we've officially, successfully, gently, I might add, walked people through the month of November. And before we wrap up, I'd love for you to share with the listeners where they can find out more about you, where they can stalk you on the internet if they're also a Mercury and Scorpio, and if you have anything coming up that you would like people to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is dianaroseharper.com. It will switch over to damashena.com, which is harder to spell, but I'm assuming that there will be links.
It will be in the show notes.
There'll be show notes. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. I have a Patreon. One thing that I'm really enthusiastic about right now is this workshop that I created over the course of kind of the first half of this year. That is now, I did 2 beta runs with my patrons, and now like the final version, like the recording of it alongside a workbook, is available. It's on the first and second houses. But it's really explicitly about like identifying existential needs and identifying genuine resourcing. So not just financial resourcing, but like expanding your idea of resourcing and being able to identify for yourself in your own chart what your true needs are and what your true resources are. And I think, I don't know, I think it's one of the most important things that I've made, because I feel like we're at this junction, with Uranus and Taurus square Saturn and Aquarius, where we really need to be updating our understanding of what grants us stability. So that's something that I'm really stoked on. And I don't currently have any projects in the pipeline that I feel like I can talk about. Is that true? Yeah, I mean, there's some projects in the pipeline, but I can't really talk about them yet. But yeah, I also encourage, like, follow me on social media. But if you really actually want to make sure that you're in the loop, join my newsletter, which you can do on my website. I don't send many newsletters yet, but it's just a more reliable way to keep in touch. So
for sure. Well, we'll be sure to have all of the links and the things for that in the show notes, of course. And thank you so much for joining and helping guide the listeners through the month to come. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mary Grace. It's always good to talk with you.